When it comes to game development, time is always your worst enemy. Whether it's the short-term pushes and phases, trying to get them completed and tested so you can put the bigger picture together, or the overall release window, where you need to cut whole pieces of a project just to make your gold time frame, the clock is your enemy, and it's fully aware of it. Such was the case for Vanilla WoW, with development starting almost alongside Warcraft 3 and running up well to the last minute. So much content was cut or simply left unfinished leading up to release that even late patches were still adding in quests and NPCs slated for the 2004 launch. That's not all either. Even later expansions had whole sections cut out, either because the expansion was performing poorly and Blizzard wanted to cut its losses for the fourth or fifth time, or resources were stretched too thin to justify the work. Welcome to Ancient Lore, a discussion series where we peel back the layers of world building and story to examine, understand, and discuss where we came from in the World of Warcraft. Today's topics are the unfinished and forgotten corners of World of Warcraft. And as always, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below or connect with me on my Discord. As usual, we'll begin by setting our parameters. With referring to cut content, generally speaking, we're only using cut or unused information from the MMOs. While sometimes the books or comics may help try to fill those gaps, we won't be including anything from them, as we're keeping everything in the context of what wasn't included in games, expansions, and patch releases. We'll start, as we often will, with Vanilla's release in November of 2004. When World of Warcraft launched, we were suddenly presented with this massive and complex world to plunge into the depths of. The exploration alone infatuated many of us, with groups of players forming guilds dedicated to uncovering every corner of Azeroth, some even using methods of breaking traditional game mechanics like wall jumping or private clients to do so. One of the first things players discovered days into Vanilla's launch was the Ironforge Airfield. Located just above Ironforge, it wasn't particularly difficult to get to, even before they made it an actual part of the zone in Cataclysm. It features a fully furnished oval airfield, supplied with gnomish flying machines, steam tanks, tents and bunkers, and even a placeholder Ironforge gatehouse. It's clear that the zone was intended for some serious use, even without NPCs running around it or trolls charging in from the south. What isn't clear is why it was never actually utilized, as unlike many of the other parts of WoW we'll be talking about here, it was very much feature complete. Fortunately, the airfield was eventually utilized in Cataclysm and is a wonderful addition to the world at large. Staying on the Alliance side of things, there's more than just incomplete zones we'll be speaking on today. Quest lines were also either cut short or not included at times. A strong example of this is The Missing Diplomat, a quest line for the Alliance that starts out as an investigation into devious activity regarding an intercepted Stormwind diplomat that was scheduled to arrive in Theramore to meet with Jaina Proudmoore, but never made it. Through the investigation, you discover that it wasn't just a diplomat, but the king of Stormwind himself, Varian Wrynn, that was intercepted and abducted, and that the Defias used disenfranchised deserters hidden in Theramore's guard to enable his capture. You find the lead traitor, beat the snot out of him, and assist in his capture, and then nothing. You're promised a speedy follow-up from Jaina herself as, the king of Stormwind is missing, but it never happens. This is possibly one of the clearest examples of unfinished quest lines in Vanilla, but not the only one. Another later example of this is the chained essence of Aranicus, and while many players chose to hold onto the trinket for some in the moment AoE power, those in the know could head over to a remote cave in the Swamps of Sorrow to discover more about Aranicus and how we could help him. Afterwards, we're sent to a spirit speaker deep in Winterspring in an attempt to communicate with Aranicus and find out how we can help him, and then nothing. The end. There are a few other quest chains that were never finished, but these are the best examples of them in vanilla. On the note of quest chains and quests in general, there were more than a few factions that never saw the true light of day, or the quests that actively supported them. Many will know of the dropped Ravasor faction in Ungoro for the Horde that ended up getting implemented in later expansion, but did you know that Kalimdor as a whole had multiple zones and factions that were simply left incomplete? Let's look at an example. Desolace is, as its name states, pretty desolate. So much of that in Cataclysm, it's one of the most heavily revamped zones. Originally, there were plans for the Centaur faction to have not only more quests, but more rep rewards, and more long-term interaction, specifically with late-game crafting patterns, kind of like we see with the Timbermaw. What we got were just friendly rewards with a single quest line for each one once you hit friendly. An honest disappointment that left the zone feeling unused, with exception for Maradon. Another zone that clearly was left unfinished was Silithus, later patched and updated with quests as well as a pair of raids. On release, the zone contained all of 2 quests, and one was a seed quest from Moonglade. We had no concept of what all these giant armies of bugs were doing here, or what this giant gate at the south of the zone was, or why the Cenarian Circle was so concerned about the area, or why Southwind Village is chock full of dead Kaldori spirits. Thankfully, the Anchorage patch brought dozens of quests, more mobs, more drops, and in general, a ton to do throughout the zone, making it a vital endgame destination for many players. While not a zone itself, it's vital we bring up Uldum while we're in the southern part of Kalimdor. One of the biggest parts of vanilla that had lore and story experts asking questions, we knew nearly nothing about the gates of Uldum and whatever it tried to hold inside it, besides the fact that it was a Titan facility and it required a separate access key that players didn't have. Falling under the category of both an unfinished quest line and an unfinished zone, speculation on Uldum ran rampant even as late as Wrath. When it was announced Uldum would be an Egyptian-themed funhouse kind of zone that, while it gave us a new zone in Kalimdor to explore, was a monumental disappointment of poorly written storylines and daily quests. What we could have had with Uldum, even if we're just going off some of the more grounded speculations from vanilla, sadly would have been better than what we ended up getting. Even zones that we may think of as not necessarily unfinished had material left on the cutting room floor, as both Winterspring and Ajara both had material simply left out before launch, and neither really had it addressed until Cataclysm came along. Indeed, Ajara ended up receiving a goblin-sized revamp for the 3rd expansion pack for World of Warcraft, completely changing how the zone felt and played. Winterspring never changed much, but that's more due to the zone that it was supposed to lean into originally, the peak of Mount Hydel. Leading us into a whole different kind of cut content, Hydel represents not a missing questline or unfinished faction, but a whole zone that never made it into vanilla. Originally intended to be a level 60 zone in-game, Hydel's assets were developed and the area was skinned, but NPC, quest lines, and loot were never placed. There's even data on mining and herbalism nodes that were ready to go, but only utilized for the Cataclysm version of the zone. One of the most popular things to do as an explorer in vanilla was wall jumping into Hydel and checking the zone out and all the unused assets. In the same Kaldori-styled vein, we have to point out the small mountain of unused Emerald Dream assets. Originally tagged as a potential 40-man raid, the Emerald Dream is described as a perfect reflection of Azeroth if mortal hands never touched it, nature's perfection of the world incarnate. The unused zone isn't quite so large, focusing on what appears to be a small island or part of a peninsula, scattered with different tree assets that were eventually used as part of Hydel's update in Cataclysm, as well as textures and some mapping details that were recycled into the end of the Emerald Dream raid for Legion. Going back to Ajara just south of Hydel once again, there's an obvious giant crater or mountain thing in the map. with the Horde and Alliance marked entrances. Most folks won't remember that for a time, Blizzard was hard at work on a 4th battleground for vanilla called Ajara Crater, featuring control points and push mechanics from both Alterac Valley and Arathi Basin. They got pretty far with this actually, especially with the large dragon statues that dominated the mini-zone. But unfortunately, it had to be abandoned in favor of development for Burning Crusade. Assets for the zone are gorgeous though, and I strongly recommend everyone look into them when they have time on their own. Moving over to the Eastern Kingdoms, there's a few pieces of very obviously missing cut content, and we'll start with the most glaring one. To the north of the Plaguelands in vanilla, there's a blocked pass with a high elf standing out in front of it. His name, glorious and resplendent, is Adon. And this was Blizzard's way of telegraphing that the homeland of the High Elves would one day be included in a future expansion. An effort had been made to include Quel'Thalas in the original release, but from my understanding, early on in World of Warcraft development, it was deemed something that had to be cut for time and resources. Thankfully enough, we got to see it in full in the Burning Crusade. In a similar situation to Quel'Thalas, in being cut very early for time and resources, the islands located to the center left of the Eastern Kingdoms must be brought up. Tol Barad, Zuldair, Crestfall, Baelor, and the island nation of Kul'Taras itself. We know Blizzard developers wanted to include at least Kul'Taras in the original release of World of Warcraft. However, just like Quel'Thalas, it had to be sacrificed for time and resources. We ended up needing to wait for Cataclysm to see Tol Barad, and Battle for Azeroth to finally experience an unfortunately bloated and poorly written Kul'Taras. This is one of my personal gripes against how the development cycle progressed for vanilla TBC and Wrath, and the tunnel vision that came with them, as a tiny water-bound mercantile nation of Kul'Taras is something we deserve to experience early on, versus how late BFA arrived in Warcraft's overall lifespan. Just north of where Kul'Taras should sit, we have another egregious missing part of the continent. Tucked tightly and securely behind the Grey Main Wall is the nation-state of Gilneas, what's described as the most resource-rich and well-to-do of all the human nations in the Eastern Kingdoms. No assets for any kind of Gilnean structures, armor, or weapons were included in any version of WoW before Cataclysm, where the zone was finally designed. This was an incredibly unfortunate missing piece of content, but on the bright side of things, the delay in revealing Gilneas gave Blizzard the opportunity to put an incredibly stylized twist on the Peninsula nation-state, which players revel in to this day. In our last piece of cut content from vanilla, and one we see pop up regularly nowadays, the Tower of the Guardian, Karazhan. Sticking out well into the darkened skies over the ravine it rests in, and despite assets having been ready for it as early as 2006, we didn't see a release of the 10-man tower raid until the launch of Burning Crusade as its opening raid. While it's unfortunate we had to wait a little bit to see the inside of Karazhan, the wait wasn't long at all, and it was well worth it. I think everyone is grateful we got the Karazhan 10-man that we did, and many of the follow-ups we got to experience as well. Running forward in time, past Burning Crusade to Wrath of the Lich King, we have one massive, glaring, and very unfortunate piece of content that got a serious reduction in size and impact. Reduced from a massive underground zone to a series of two tiny instances, Ajal Narub was meant to be the largest and possibly the most complex zone in all of Wrath. Plans for the home of the Nerubians were scrapped very early on in development for the expansion, regarded as too costly in time and resources, and assets were reused for the two instances that ended up being used in place of the zone. The winding tunnels of the Underkingdom were supposed to have wound throughout the continent, providing a different way to traverse the world, and the zone would also have provided a whole new mountain of lore and content on the Old Gods, and specifically Yogg-Saron. We never got any of that. One of the biggest things we were looking forward to in Wrath, other than Icecrown itself, and it was an absolute tragedy. To close, let's blast a little more forward in time, or rather a lot more forward. Warlords of Draenor, by many measures, was one of the least liked expansions in all of Warcraft history, and while I won't bemoan how short the expansion ended up being, we did miss out on a pair of zones. The first, in a callback to Burning Crusade, was the Plains of Farallon, a zone that was supposed to be north of the Tanaan Jungle Peninsula and would have eventually turned into Netherstorm, the floating rocks in space we had to jump between in TBC. This turned into a bit of a joke at this point, as by the time we were closing up Warlords, it was a full-on meme that Blizzard would, at will, cut content from expansion. In addition, from Warlords, there's a giant glaring issue of cut content in the form of Shattrath, the city that was the hub for TBC. In Warlords, it's under heavy siege from the Iron Horde, with battle raging across it and the Shatari forces in desperate need of assistance. Nothing happens with it though. No quests, no assisting them, nothing. From our understanding, it was supposed to be a raid of some kind, but it was never implemented. There's no assets, or quests, or NPCs from this planned raid, unfortunately. Then it's safe to assume it would have involved Hydel, or other Naru, or other Shatari forces as callbacks to their TBC counterparts. Very unfortunate, as seeing the totality of Shattrath in its prime before being decimated by the Horde, iron or otherwise, would have been an incredible experience. A quick note while we're still in Warlords, on the Warlords map for Draenor, there's this odd, mysterious, bulky-looking continent to the far south. The speculation at the time was that's the home continent of the Ogres, but unfortunately, we never find out what this slab of land even contains, let alone the peoples and cultures that inhabit it. There's more. There's so much more content that was cut that we could go over. And while the majority of it involves zones or raids that just couldn't get fit in, Blizzard does do a better job of not leaving quest lines or zones unfinished compared to what they do with vanilla. In a future episode, we'll go into detail on Uldum and the Titans, Blizzard's favorite big dumb objects, as well as an upcoming episode on the aspects of death in Warcraft, from Necrolites to Ner'zhul. Look forward to both in the near future. We close this book of Warcraft history here and save the rest for another time. If you've enjoyed this feature, please consider subscribing here at youtube.com/thedannation, as well as joining my Discord at tinyurl.com/danscord. It's a Discord, but with 100% more Dan. A big thank you to Turtle Wow, where most of the visual footage you see during this episode was recorded at, as well as having provided the backing track for this piece. An additional thank you to those who signed up for memberships here on YouTube. Your financial support is greatly appreciated. From the Lore Bunker in Boston, Massachusetts, this is Dan wishing you a wonderful and wide world of lore.